A U.S. Marine posted outside the Oval Office of the White House signals U.S. President Donald Trump is back at work while battling COVID-19. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. U.S. President Donald Trump returned to the Oval Office on Wednesday after his physician reported the president has been symptom-free from coronavirus for over 24 hours. The president reportedly wants to address the nation and get back to campaigning as soon as possible. More than a dozen people with close ties to the administration have contracted the virus in recent days. We begin our coverage with CGTN's Nathan King outside the grounds of the White House. And Nathan, within the last hour or so, they've released a videotape from the president. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Yeah. I can't hear anything.
All right, so we're having difficulty with the tape, but I can tell you that he talked about that we have it now. Let's listen.
For me, I walked in, I didn't feel good. A short 24 hours later, I was feeling great. I wanted to get out of the hospital. And that's what I want for everybody. I want everybody to be given the same treatment as your president. Because I feel great. I feel like perfect.
He says he feels perfect. What can you tell us about the president's condition?
Well, I mean, he seems great, right? But he's given the most dramatic cocktail of drugs anyone has been given under COVID-19, including drugs that made him feel better, whether he is better or not. So, you know, we need to really watch the president over the next few days. It's great to see him up and about. No one wishes him ill, but he does seem up, doesn't he? Very much. And the steroids that he's been given and other drugs, experimental, are not actually, frankly, available to the rest of the American people. And the fact that he has tweeted out that, you know, I can overcome this, we can overcome this, don't make it a big part of your life, frankly, has not gone down well with the American people, with over 210,000 deaths, 7.5 million cases, and as you know, 25 states now reporting more cases than they have done. They're in the red zone. This is not over. It may be over the president. We really hope so. We want him to get back to work. He's the leader of the United States of America. But this is not necessarily the case, and we're going to have to watch it. What's quite incredible about that video is that, you know, we know he's been urging everyone that he wants to go back to work. That was filmed in the sort of edge of the Rose Garden, if you like, just behind me here at the White House, just by the Oval Office. He's been in the Oval Office, he's been talking about some sort of stimulus package, even though he's rejected it over the last 24 hours. And it's obviously eager that he wants to show that he wants to get back to work. Unfortunately, for most people with COVID, you do get these ups and downs. And unfortunately, from Sean Conley, the White House physician, all we get is like, look, the president's feeling great, the treatment's working well, he hasn't had a fever for 4 days, he hasn't shown any symptoms for 24 hours, but we just don't know, to be frank. And as you know, I've had friends who have unfortunately passed away from COVID. They can feel great for a moment and then not feel so great. So let's hope he is on the up and up, because that's really important.
It seems as though he's not the only one on steroids. His Twitter account also appears to be on steroids. And of course, as you mentioned, he called off negotiations with a flourish with congressional Democrats on Tuesday via Twitter. We saw the markets tank. Now he seems to have a change of heart on the stimulus talks. Where do things stand?
Yeah, I think someone's shown in the polling on not providing stimulus to the American people or businesses before the next election. Look, there were some very delicate negotiations going on while he was in the hospital, and when he came back between Nancy Pelosi, the House Democrat leader, and Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and the Republican leadership in the Senate. It looked like there may be some way forward. He's now rejected that. I think he's trying to insert himself as the president. He's sort of backtracked now in a series of tweets, as you said, which seem to be very much on steroids, saying, look, we'll just address certain small things like a $1,200 payment to American families, perhaps rescue the airlines, etc., etc. But a lot of this has actually been rejected on the Hill outright by his own party as well. We'll have to wait and see. I just want to say one other thing also, is that it's not just about President Trump, is it? I mean, you said a dozen members of his staff have been infected. I can tell you it's more than that. It's actually more than double that. 24, at least I can count. And those are the people that make the headlines. I think, you know, it's at least 40 or 50 when you count the Capitol Hill as well. We've seen a big spike here in Washington, D.C. because of those cases. They have resisted contract tracing from the event 10 days ago with the Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. And there's a real feeling here that things could get worse. And, you know, we don't know the condition of a lot of people among his staff that haven't had the same sort of treatment that he's had. I can tell you one thing, Mike, the reason we're out here tonight is because we don't feel safe inside. And that's quite incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is. Thanks so much, Nathan. That's White House correspondent Nathan King reporting for us. Let's bring in our panel now. Joining us from Detroit is Brandon Brice. He's a political commentator and host of the radio show Straight Talk. Also with us from Monterey, California is Spencer Critchley. He's a Democratic strategist and author of Patriots of Two Nations, Why Trump Was Inevitable and What Happens Next. From New York, Lincoln Mitchell is a research scholar at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and Dr. Calvin Soon is an attending physician and clinical assistant professor in emergency medicine. And Calvin, let me start with you. I want to get your thoughts on the president talking about this, you know, this miracle treatments he's getting, and Nathan pointing out that, you know, that's not available to everybody. You're on the front lines. You can tell us if that's the case. And I also want to get your thoughts about him making this address, no mask on, again, even though one would think he's still infected.
If he was in my emergency room and he was out there giving a speech like that and saying things like that, he would have already have signed out against medical advice. That if he can even demonstrate capacity, he understands that the risks of him leaving my emergency room healthcare setting with the course of the virus, and we know that how infectious you can be, especially when the first 10 to 14 days of symptoms, it's considered irresponsible. We can't quarantine him against his will. That's hardly able to be enforced in this country. But right now, for him to say all these things and to say that he got the miracle treatment, stuff that I have never even could have access to other than the steroids, this is against medical advice. And somebody can classify that as ethically irresponsible.
And the doctor has rather rosy prognostications, but Nathan makes a good point. I know I was talking to somebody today who had the coronavirus in March, still having lingering effects, brain fog, that sort of thing, saying he's not out of the woods, but you're a physician. You tell us, is he out of the woods? What's your prognostication?
I speak as a physician and also as a human being. My grandfather died this way. He was feeling great, speaking 10 words a minute, saying all these wonderful things, how great he was, and then he dropped dead a few hours later. It's called silent hypoxia. This is how I see countless patients die in front of me. I have seen things that will give you nightmares for the rest of your life. Literally people with wave highs, like I'm going to the bathroom, and then find them dead in the bathroom, let alone people who die in the waiting room. And I'm trying to resuscitate them with CPR, dragging their body into the emergency room, bringing them back to life, then to find out they died 4 hours later. You feel great before you die. I'm not saying that he will, because he has access to these, quote, miracle drugs that I did not have access to in the emergency room, but you never know. And what about the 210,000 other Americans with their stories about feeling great before they take a turn for the worst? It's always within 10 to 11 days before the symptoms manifest itself. So it's still too early to say that he is out of the woods.
And I want to ask you about contact tracing, too, because the White House is opposed to that. We've seen so many stories where it's vitally important. And the other thing I want to ask you about is Mark Meadows emerged from the Oval Office today along with Dan Scavino. They were wearing masks, but you're in the field. We've seen medical personnel who've actually gotten the virus. Some have died, even with PPE. How dangerous is it for them to be meeting with him?
How about some people who died? These are my friends and colleagues who I can't talk to anymore because they're dead. They literally, I remember crying in the waiting room saying that they were afraid, and then they never, find out that they were having a funeral 2 weeks later. These are my fellow nurses, fellow doctors, fellow colleagues, friends and family, people who I know who had all the PPE that they were made available to them. Oh, that's another thing. Must be nice to go to a place where you probably had enough PPE for you, because we were struggling where I was wearing the same N95 mask for the last 9 days during March and April. 9 days for a thing that's supposed to be disposable. So you can have all the masks, you can do all the precautions, but you're just taking unnecessary risk when you have somebody who is known COVID, who was admitted to having COVID, who left the hospital a little too early than the rest of us, and is still in treatment. He's getting the 5th dose in the White House. He's in treatment. That means he's still infectious. And his own CDC says, please do not come into contact with anyone for the first 10 days out since your first positive case or first positive test or symptoms, and he's not even near the 10-day mark. So it is irresponsible, but that's the consequences that they're going to happen. They're going to have to take ownership of that when it does happen.
And Brandon, I want to ask you about President Trump. As I mentioned, he's been tweeting quite a bit. He said that COVID-19 is less lethal than the flu. Facebook and Twitter took action on that. Facebook removing the post altogether, and Twitter messaging that this was misleading. Let me ask you about that. What do those comments accomplish for him?
Well, as someone who lives in a state and a city who had some of the largest COVID crises, this is one time where I'm going to have to back away from the president's comments and say COVID is serious. The thing is that to come out of the hospital after having 3 days of COVID, I don't know anyone who came out of COVID that quick. You're talking about a 10 to 14 day issue that most patients have to deal with. But there's a couple things here. I think one of the things is this is who the president is. And I think there are still people that are going to look at this and say this is a sign of strength. But I think the large majority of folks are saying that, if anything, this is talking about why COVID is exposing the health disparities. The fact that the president, if he was able to get a health care better than any other American, why can't other Americans have that type of health care? And so this is going to pose some much bigger questions when you talk about the 200,000 people, 4 of those who were my personal friends, who have died due to COVID. Yes, some people have said that the media has overhyped it, but the reality is 200 people, 200 Americans are dead, and there's an upcoming presidential debate, hopefully, and the president's going to have to speak on that and is going to have to atone for that. Some people have said that, this may have been political. I'll tell you, if I were the president's chief of staff, I would have said, do not show your face for at least a few weeks. Make sure that you are being responsible and make sure that you are showing, when the president speaks, the world listen. He's got to lead by example.
Lincoln, let me ask you about the president's return to the White House on Monday. He said Americans do not need to let COVID rather dominate their lives. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Don't let it dominate. Don't let it take over your lives. Don't let that happen. We have the greatest country in the world. We're going back to work. We're going to be out front. As your leader, I had to do that. I knew there's danger to it, but I had to do it. I stood out front. I led. Nobody that's a leader would not do what I did. And I know there's a risk, there's a danger, but that's okay.
So Calvin and Brandon also mentioned that they know people who've had COVID. Nathan mentioned it. I know people. This was really an opportunity for him to kind of show some empathy, maybe say, I feel your pain. Did he miss that opportunity?
Well, like our previous guest, I've lost one very close relative to COVID as well. So this has touched many Americans. You didn't pick this panel knowing we'd all lost somebody, but this is where America is. When you listen to Trump's comments, what's important to remember, your correspondent said America wants Trump to get back to work. That's not entirely accurate. America wants Trump to get out of the Oval Office, right? This man is so unpopular. He's about 12 to 15 points underwater in popularity and approval. He's trailing Biden badly in the polls. So when he says that, Trump is speaking to his base. The rest of America has tuned Donald Trump out. If you listen closely to those words, he thinks he's Winston Churchill in the Battle of Britain, bravely standing up against, German attacks. He's not. He's a foolish man who lives in a fantasy world and caught a disease and doesn't even have the presence of mind to empathize with all of the Americans who are suffering from this disease. Instead, he wants us to look at him as having done something heroic, when all he did was do something kind of petulant and frankly stupid by exposing himself. But, as we think about the 24 people who we can name, the Hope Hickses, the Kellyanne Conways, the Stephen Millers, to me this raises 2 important questions. One, I can kind of understand why Donald Trump got better health care than, for example, one of our guests' grandfathers or my uncle. I mean, unfortunately, that may just be the reality, but is Stephen Miller going to get better treatment? Is Kellyanne Conway? Is this just a matter of if you're friendly with the president, you get better treatment? but also we don't know how many people he put at risk whose names we don't know. For example, the Secret Service people in the car. For example, the support staff and the administrative staff in the White House. The people who are not political appointees, maybe they work in the kitchen or something. So his action is extremely reckless. Instead of a leader, he's become a super spreader. And all this has done is it's pushed most Americans to further tuning him out as the election approaches. It doesn't matter what he says to the country anymore because the country is no longer listening.
Spencer, 27 days before the election, I want to get your thoughts. What did this photo op do for him?
I agree. I think he's in very serious trouble, and we're watching his presidency imploding before our eyes, and we're watching his behavior become increasingly frantic as he tries to figure out what story he could possibly spin to get himself out of this trouble, which is really his only tactic as essentially a lifelong con man. And I would say a very seriously damaged human being. I actually feel some compassion for him, wondering what the pain must have been like of his childhood to turn him into a person who's grown up to be apparently incapable of imagining the lives of others and seeing everything as a projection of himself. I think this is also, as terrible as it is, it's, if I could be forgiven for using the word, it's the perfect crisis for his presidency, because as I found in researching my book, the division we're experiencing now didn't start with Trump, and in fact, it goes all the way back to the founding of the country. And he really represents a worldview that's different from the founders' worldview, but it's one that's always been there, and it's one that actually rejects the Enlightenment legacy of reason in favor of faith, tradition, loyalty to the leader, ties to the native land, and ethnic identity. And I think that's one reason why it feels like we're living in different realities when we talk to Trump supporters. But what's happening now is Trump's reality is actually colliding with the reality that kills more than 210,000 Americans, or destroys our reputation, or blows up the economy, has these real world impacts that cannot, as I say, be spun away with a story.
And does that shatter that that kind of mythology for his followers?
Yes, yes. I would have predicted, and I do predict this in the book. I describe what would shake the absolute loyalty of his followers, which we should think of, I would say, in pre-Enlightenment terms, as if we're in the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. If you imagine knights, loyal to their king on the battlefield, and nothing will shake their oath of loyalty because his authority is embodied in him, except failure. And that's what we're seeing here.
Brandon, let me ask you about the calling off of the negotiation with Democrats in a fiery tweet, and then you kind of backpedaled today. Where do you see that?
Here's the reality. If you're going to go to work, then you need to go to work. And I think the challenge is that, you can't come back to work, but then not do the job of what the president's supposed to do, and that's supposed to lead. I want to go back real quick. You said something which was interesting when you talk about this thing of leadership. The reality is some Republicans are still going to stick with the president, and there is still a faction of the country that still supports the president. He knows it. The challenge is though, are the independents, that 44% that is still undecided, this could be the coup de grace where they say, you know what, I lost a grandfather, a sister, a brother. That's the group that he's got to be worried about moving forward in the next 20 days.
And Brandon, what do you read into last night? There was a debate. Martha McSally, who's been a supporter of the president, was asked, I think, 3 or 4 times, are you proud of being a supporter of his? And she kind of evaded the question. What does that say about, followers in the Senate?
Well, what that says is that, the president may win in November, but the problem is he's got 100 other senators who need to also win. This puts a burden on them. I mean, I can tell you, even if you go back to the white supremacy comment during the debates, that affected a lot of senators where they had to atone for that, and many stayed silent. And so I think it's those issues, and it's issues like this where the Senate, whether they like it or not, they've got to atone and explain that. That is what the president also needs to be thinking about when he makes these comments.
Spencer, there are 11 million fewer jobs since February. Looking at this, 26 million Americans unemployed, as many as 50,000 airline employees. The economy is still very tenuous. Let's listen to the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell talking about this.
The current economic downturn is the most severe in our lifetimes. It will take a while to get back to the levels of economic activity and employment that prevailed at the beginning of the year. and it will take continued support from both monetary and fiscal policy to achieve that.
He's pushing Congress to come up with some economic relief package. Do you think there's any chance that's going to happen?
Oh, it's such a mess. And, you know, the president's chaotic behavior yesterday with apparently holding the relief bill hostage, it sounded like it was essentially he was tweeting, "Reelect me, and then you can have relief from this terrible catastrophe economically," before he saw the stock market plummet and changed his mind. I'm not confident, unfortunately, in this environment. I think the best thing for the economy as well as for the health of Americans is to just defeat this man in the upcoming election as fast as we possibly can, and we can't do it any faster than Election Day.
Brandon, the president says he's going to be in Miami on October 15th for that next presidential debate. There are some saying it probably shouldn't go forward. There's still going to be a question of whether or not he's infected. Let me ask you this. What's your take on him actually being there for this debate?
Well, first of all, I think we need debates, period. It's the American way. So when people say, oh, we don't need debates, but the issue now is the guy's got, well, he's coming off of COVID. And so the question is, does Biden want to debate or be next to a guy who just has COVID when he's a senior citizen himself? So I think that poses many issues. But the other thing is, the president, I think he should debate. He's got to focus on the economy because it's really his last card to play. The healthcare thing didn't go over well. The comment during the debate didn't go over well. The economy's his last play, and he's got to beat that dead horse. If he doesn't, it could look very different in November.
Calvin, let me ask you, if you were to give advice to the vice president, what would you suggest? Because we don't really know when he was infected. We don't know when he was last tested. There's all these questions surrounding his condition. What would you say to Biden if you were advising him?
I mean, the CDC says you have to wait at least 10 days. 14 days for me, 25 days if you're on the ICU level of infection, which of all the drugs that he's gotten, he suggests that those drugs said he should belong in the ICU. So 25 days. So he definitely should not even be leaving his house to debate, but we should have debates in this country. So I would suggest for Biden is to posit the probability of doing it virtually, putting him in a cone on the debate stage. It's like it's a hermetically sealed room that he doesn't infect other people, just having him isolated and being able to give his responses from there. He was the one who got COVID, and he has to take responsibility for catching that infection. Biden's team took very good precautions in preventing COVID, and he's still testing himself to be negative, and therefore he should be able to have access to certain debate privileges because he's healthy. He's not going to infect everybody. And not to say we shouldn't have a debate and we don't want to make it unfair, but we also need to protect the integrity of the lives of people around him. So there has to be shifting of a balance of what is fair and what is not fair. If you're not going to take precautions and you get sick, you have to own the consequences of getting sick.
Spencer, the vice president gave this speech, a very powerful speech earlier this week at Gettysburg about national unity. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I'm running as a proud Democrat, but I will govern as an American president. I'll work with Democrats and Republicans. I'll work as hard for those who don't support me as those who do. That's the job of a president.
So, Spencer, there's a stark difference between these messages coming from the former vice president and President Trump. Give me your take on what he had to say.
I did find it inspiring, and I think it's appropriate that he was evoking the spirit of a great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who appealed to the better angels of our nature. And I think that that sums up the candidacy of Joe Biden. In the years since, the roles of the parties have flipped. The Republicans used to be anti-slavery, and the Democrats were defenders of slavery, and now we've kind of seen a switch of those roles. Unfortunately, with the modern Republican Party, we've also seen this descent into darkness. And I think Joe Biden is more of a candidate of light and hope versus a candidate of fear and darkness. And as much as we've seen the power of fear and darkness, especially during the last 4 years, and we sometimes think it's overwhelming, when given a choice of a strong leader who also offers hope and appeals to the better angels of our nature, almost all voters prefer that and will go for that. I'll be astonished if Joe Biden doesn't win the upcoming election.
And Lincoln, to that point, these new polls are coming out in Pennsylvania, a double-digit lead, if you believe the polls there. That, of course, a very important pivotal swing state. National polls also showing these large leads. Give me your sense of where the race is at this point.
Well, I don't think you have a Republican consultant on this show, but if you did and you had one speak honestly, they would tell you this race is over. You know, being down 7 to 10 points in the most polls, worse for Trump in the more recent ones, as the incumbent, it's a very, very high mountain to climb for Donald Trump. We talk about the need for debates. Frankly, I'm skeptical. I believe with the doctor. I agree with the doctor. Donald Trump, this is on Donald Trump. Joe Biden should not put himself at risk, but it should be the debate commission that tells Donald Trump these are the standards. You know, we're in the middle of baseball playoffs now. You can't, if you test positive as a baseball player, you can't rejoin the team until you have 2 negative tests in a row. Same thing should be true for Donald Trump. But so I don't think my point is that the debate is not going to change anything here. The American people have made up their minds about Donald Trump. He has not been above 50% in approval ratings ever. He has not been ahead of Joe Biden in any serious poll, more than a quirky one here and there since early March. He has very, very little chance, whether he has COVID, whether he doesn't, whether he cuts a deal with Nancy Pelosi or whether he doesn't. The American people have largely made up their mind. Many of these polls show Biden above 50%. If you're consistently hitting above 50% nationally and in swing states, and you're the challenger, that's extremely bad for the incumbent. But we also have to talk about something else, which is probably the most, sadly, the most remembered thing Trump said from the debate, which was, Proud Boys, stand back and stand by, right? What Donald Trump, and we've seen this more and more from the Republican Party since that debate, what they are doing is gearing up, not just for voter suppression through making it harder for some people, notably African Americans, to access the franchise, but actually going to the polls and stopping people from voting and intimidating people and trying to stop the vote counting and trying to push Republican legislatures in key states like Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Florida to seat Republican electors regardless of the popular vote. I've worked on elections in dozens of countries. I know, so I have can put this in some kind of international context. In the election observation business, we call that stealing the election. And that is what Donald Trump is doing right now. And if we have a discussion about the horse race and the poll numbers, and should he debate and should he not debate, and can he pull off a miracle, that's a fun way to kibitz, but it's not getting at the heart of the political challenge facing the United States of America right now, which is an unpopular president who is, charitably speaking, behaving erratically, is preparing through his political party and through essentially armed thugs to steal the election. And we better be prepared for that, because as what we really do not want, nobody in America wants, is violence, chaos, and the breakdown of the rule of law. And that is the direction in which, very specifically, Donald Trump is pushing this country right now.
Well, we've run out of time, but I want to thank all of you for joining us. Really appreciate it. That is this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.